Okay, hello, welcome to the review video. Sorry for coming out at such a late time and especially on the last day. I do apologize for that. I've been facing a lot of, you know, difficult things the past week, especially today as well. It took up a lot of my time, so I'm sorry for getting this out such last minute. I'm gonna try to keep this short and sweet, but there's a lot of information. I'm going to sort of focus on the major ideas leading up into sort of the World War eras. And then with those, I'm going to give sort of like a brief highlight of the major takeaway from them. I'm not really going to go too much in detail and stuff because you do have your notes for that. I'll just be focusing on sort of like new ideologies that are being introduced or new ideas that are being formulated. Um, And I think that is all. Also, I do apologize. I just made this, so it may seem a little like discombobulated, and I do not have any memes this go around. This one's going to be strictly informational. So sorry for no fun. But let's get into this. Okay, so first, we're really focused, like we focused on the challenges to industrialization. 'Cause the last time we left off, right, we're leaving this era of sort of revolutions and enlightenment thinking, right? The world is starting to progress, especially Europe. Asia, not so much, except a few exceptions, right? And I'll get into that. I'm sort of alluding to, Japan, right? Um, so we see sort of the industry take off in Britain. But with the industry taking off, there's also these sort of social issues now being arisen from this industry, right? And so we're going to focus on, Britain's social life right now. So you can see like there's discontent. You have the Chartists and the Luddites, right? So the Chartists are more of your politician, grassroots activist type, wanted the vote for men, wanted mandatory education, wanted these sort of civil rights, you could argue, right? So that these basic necessities, right? These unalienable rights we go by in our society, right? Then the Luddites, I sort of view them as vigilantes, right? They saw the enemy as the machines and sort of retaliating and protesting against the industry itself, not necessarily trying to resolve issues. Um, and then we see the response sort of from, major industry workers and sort of this bourgeoisie, right? Going in some Marxist terms, which I'll get into later, including Marx, but sort of the bourgeoisie is wanting to sort of send a message, right? So you have the Peterloo Massacre, which puts down sort of um, the Luddites and the Chartists in a protest. I think it was something along those lines of protest, the revolution, things like that. And the House of Commons responded to this and created sort of reforms that restricted, Luddites and Chartist movements. They were viewed more of like the enemy now to the industry. And so we see this sort of narrative come around where we get this very classist view, right? It now becomes the middle class and these. And so it's like you have to be confined to the industry and the industry is ruling everything. So now the industry is taking power as a dominant economic sector, right? Again, I'm alluding to some Marxist thinking here. I'll explain later on, but um, sort of the industry is taking over, right? It goes from this feudal system to now the industry. But of course, though, we are all humans and we fight for social equality and social rights. So, later reforms started coming out where it's now in more like progressive favor, right? You can argue this is, Enlightenment thinking, romantic thought starting to come up, right? But we're seeing that this new found ideology is taking place in progressive liberalism, progressive conservatism, these progressive notions throughout society, even socialism, right? These progressive notions are starting to have power and have authority in sort of this industry, right? This major industrial society, right? So as I alluded to a little bit, sort of the romantic and this sort of progressive conservatism, we get sort of the prime minister during this era, right? Benjamin Disraeli, right? He's sort of the head of the Conservative Party, but he's an ideal romantic, right? He was a novelist. He explored the thought and sort of like romanticism. We cover a lot, and I'm not going to cover romanticism, like have its own separate slide, but sort of the major ideas of romanticism is this fact that it's more of exploring human nature and the world around us and using that enlightened thought to do so, right? You're questioning everything and sort of, he establishes this progressive conservatism, which, um, after looking at it more, I view this more as like libertarianism, right? It's more of just wanting sort of freedom, right? Because libertarians, they want a free market, they want free rights, they want less government, restriction, things like that. They just want to be free, right? So liberty, right? The root word of it. So that's the association I would make with this idea of a progressive conservative, right? And you can attach that to romantics and to romanticism as well. Hence why, romanticism and progressive conservatism, but like romanticism's you're questioning nature. Libertarianism, you want to be free, right? So this progressive conservatism is slowly aligning with this romanticism because you're questioning, why can't you be free? Why am I not able to be free? What is restricting me, and how can I challenge this? Um, and then of course, he also backed these labor unions, going back to, he thought it was resemblance of, medieval guilds, going back to that romantic nature of seeing the beauty of things. I know I recently just wrote a paper for Professor Alvarez's other class, and I really attached romanticism to this idea of beauty, right? Because I think that's a great way to look at it. It's more of enlightenment thinking. You can think is more of like manly, right? Romanticism, we attach more to like the arts, and that could be feminine in nature, right? Going back to we talked about machismo and marrying mismo, right? Marrying Mismo could be this romanticism. Machismo is sort of this enlightened thought, right? So I'm giving you a little bit of what I just wrote about, but to me, I found that very interesting, right? So you have this element of beauty and arts and questioning the nature and the flow of the world, and then you have enlightened thought, which is sort of like logic and why are things like this? And I bring this point up because we start to see we have people like Benjamin Disraeli using, and sort of Mary Shelley, Charles Darwin, people who want to explore nature, but then you have people that are more strict on sort of liberal ideologies known with thought, right? David Lloyd George coming up, Marx and Engels, which I'll be focusing on later, right? They're using this sort of enlightened thought instead of this romantic thought, right? So now David Lloyd George, right? He was the prime minister in World War One. I'm jumping a little bit, right? Benjamin Disraeli is the mid 1800s. David Lloyd George is World War One. But what I wanted to highlight was this difference between thought, right? You have this romantic thought into politics, and now you're going back to this sort of enlightened thought in politics, right? And so you started pushing these enlightenment thinkers, right? John Stuart Mills and Harriet Taylor, right? They wanted sort of workers' comp, social security, the vote for women, more of these liberal ideologies coming from this enlightened thought. And he pushes this notion, right? And of course, I'm going to get more into this later in the World War One slide, but I just wanted to highlight, the romantic political thought and the enlightened political thought challenging this notion of industry and societies in the way that it's structured, and how we can challenge that through politics, or how they challenged it through politics, not us. Um, Oh, I lied. I guess I do have a slide on romanticism. I just made this a couple minutes ago, and I forgot my own slides. Okay, right. So romanticism is this idea of beauty, right? This artsy thing. Return to nature to learn from nature, questioning the nature of humans. I sort of touched on that a little bit. And the more artistic perspective. And going in, I just want to highlight, because we've already talked about Charles Darwin, Mary Shelley, and Deb. Just want to highlight sort of some this ideology into their works, right? So Mary Shelley, of course, created this idea of science fiction, but really it was sort of a reflection of reality, right? She's criticizing notions she saw in society through sort of the arts, right? Why is it like this? And we get science fiction to explain some things, we talk about Frankenstein and the way the world works. I'm not going to go too in depth on that because, we talked about that in class. Um, the reason why I want to bring Charles Darwin up specifically is this will align more with the World War II era. It's sort of this idea of social Darwinism, right? This sort of survival of the fittest. mindset that comes from this romantic thought, right? Sort of, you have to be the best in order to survive. And we're really going to see that a lot. This notion of social Darwinism come up with this idea and closely be attached to this idea of fascism. Um, you know, social Darwinism and fascism go hand in hand. I view, and I think because like fascism is like you need to be the best in order to survive, and we can see that in Germany, right? The Nazis felt embarrassed, felt you know that they weren't powerful enough and needed to be the best in order to prove this notion, right? So we sort of see this sort of romantic thought now being manipulated to fit the narrative of other things to promote, malintent, things like this. So we're seeing how romantic thought is now transforming throughout politics even more, and how it can be used to form other ideologies that, could be beneficial, could not be beneficial. It's the way you look at things. And I think that's a neat idea to look at Charles Darwin, because we looked at his sort of him exploring the romanticism to begin with. Now going back to what the industry and sort of modernizing, right? How is romanticism now being incorporated into sort of our modern world? And that's one way I can see it. That one connection of sort of that survival of the fittest, that social Darwinism aspect. Now it's sort of now you're switching from you're adding enlightenment thought to the romanticism, and you're combining the two. That's how it gets into it. um a very jumbled thing, but I think it's very fascinating. You can just see the connections and here and there into the politics, so that's one thing to look at. I'll touch on that more. um like I said, I'm a sociologist. I'm big into Marx. I like Marx. I've read a lot about Marx, so I really want to just focus on this, is to sort of, if you can understand Marx's theory of history, you not only understand how he views sort of socialism, but sort of his economic view and also his political view. It is a great way to understand all three elements, and that's why I sort of like Marx, because he's fascinating, because he's in every realm of the social sciences, and he uses it all to form one ideology. That's right. It's so many like fascinating things, and so it's like when you look at it, it's like, well, he's combining so many elements of our life, because it really is. The social sciences combine everything, right? Of course, psychology is not there. It's more of the brain. You don't really need this for that, but you could add psychology elements there, have all this, social sciences, but that's just something for later. So basically, in his sort of historical materialism, which is his scientific theory of history, what he claims was that, you know in the beginning, your sort of dominating class, the one who has the money, the one who has the power, sort of the aristocrats, right? And sort of the power structure was feudalism. um, or aristocrats had the power structure, and feudalism was the economic structure, right? But he was saying, because of the oppression and the class struggle, the bourgeoisie, who was the peasant class in this aristocratic society, are going to use the conflict to overthrow the monarchy and establish capitalism, right? And so now this is what we're seeing now with this modernization, right? The bourgeoisie are now in power. Capitalism is now the economic structure, right? And now this is where we get the proletariat. They're the working man, the working class. Um, and they're oppressed due to the inequalities created by competition and class conflict. This is now where competition comes in, because before it really wasn't on competition. It was mainly just on conflict between classes. Now you add in sort of this economic benefit with capitalism. Now it's this idea of competition, right? um there's a one thing, I forget what it was, but I read this, I read it somewhere, but it was like, capitalism establishes the ability for equal opportunity, but that further hinders this class conflict, because it's there and people can reach it, but only a certain amount. Not It's not equal to everyone. It's only equal to few who can get there. And I think that this explains that idea, sort of explains very well. Like, there's the potential, but there's still so many barriers to go, like, like you have to jump through in order to reach it. And so, of course, Marx's theory, this is now where Marx's theory and Marx and Engels' theories come in. Is sort of, they propose that the proletariat will overthrow sort of the bourgeoisie and create a classless utopian society based off community, right? This major sociological, excuse me, sociological theme is throughout, socialism, communism, is this idea of community working together, right? That's the whole purpose of it. There is no competition if you're in communion, right? Um, and so then after, the proletariat in power, socialism is the economic structure, or socialism is the political structure. Communism would then be the economic structure. But again, you can't reach communism until you have a like classless utopian society with no government or no state. So um, I think that is one sort of misdiagnosis of when people, we see in our modern ideology when the label of communism gets thrown out there. Um, Many of you may already know this, but just, communism hasn't been reached yet, right? Though people claim to use communism in Marxist theory, right? If we're going back to the, the root of things, we have never seen a communist society. Um, I just like giving that fact because I feel like especially that word gets thrown around a lot in our society today. So just to clear that up. But why am I including this? Like, what is the purpose of understanding this? And the purpose of this is to one understand Marx's sociological view on sort of conflict and class struggle. He understands that there's going to be struggle, right? But the struggle changes with the system, right? We see at first with the aristocrats, it was just based on power. Now it's competition power, right? There's always struggle between the lower and the upper classes, and that lower classes are going to find a way to overthrow and repel or revolt against these powers. But this also sets the foundation for a lot of the future sort of socialist societies we see, right? The Bolsheviks, Mao Zedong, right? The People's Republic of China that we talked about, in class today. They're using this ideology, they're using this structure of how things should be. The difference with the Bolsheviks and sort of Lenin view is that they wanted to rush this theory. So the Mensheviks wanted to follow this theory in suit. So they wanted to go from the aristocrat phase to capitalism phase to the socialist communist phase. The Bolsheviks wanted to skip the capitalist phase right away. They wanted to jump straight to this communist ideology and sort of have the state control everything and the state runs things like that. That's why they were able to have their industry go so fast and propel so fast because it was controlled by the state. There was no competition. There was things, and so there's benefits to going this, but again, there's ultimately the cons that come from it. And then when Stalin takes over, he sort of that's where we see the decline a bit with, and we can go more, that's more in the details. And I'm not going in that, but I just want to highlight that this is the influence for, a lot of the socialist sort of revolutions that are taking place in areas that are being affected the most economically and are lacking in industry. I spent a little bit, too much time on that one, so I need to sort of uh, hurry up now. So we're getting to now this new idea of new imperialism, right? So we see that the East India Company and British is taking over, right? That we had the image of the map where like the British Empire was like 60% of the world, right? And it was just Britons everywhere. And a lot of that goes to sort of like these major corporations. And we're going back to this idea of sort of the capitalist society now taking place, right? Sort of Britain is controlling this economic power of the world, right? Because they have so much influence everywhere. And, the East India Company um, was in competition with the French and India, but of course, the 7 Years' War kicked them out. So now they have a complete monopoly over this giant colony and it has so many resources. So they're getting a vast amount of wealth. Um, and that also helps. What also helps them too is that their culture is now taking over sort of these colonies, right? So you see like the Mughal emperor, sort of becomes the figurehead and aligns with the East India Company, but the East India Company still has the power, right? So it's like that's what's happening in these times. You have these elites aligning with the British, and then the British still have the power. The elites are just, hey, look at me. I think I have power, but I really don't. It's really the British. And so they're able to funnel wealth in and out and make themselves more wealthy. And we sort of see this notion too with the first Opium War. Um, China really didn't want British goods, right? They still thought they were the best. They were the best economically. They were the best military, militarily. They thought, they're still the dominant power. But soon they realize they're not because one, Britain is rapidly industrializing, and two, they're also controlling a mass amount of wealth. But the need or the want of silk luxury goods or Chinese luxury goods is still there, right? So of course, British wants to get on that to help boost their trade and networking and things like that. So once they realized that opium was huge in China, right, it was already implemented in their society. What they're gonna do now is sort of create the best opium and then sell it to everyone, right? Think of them like who's a major crime boss in Mexico or in Latin America? It was why am I blanking on this? It was like okay, I'm actually gonna look this up. Well, okay, just think of like a major crime boss, like that was from there that like huge in drugs, right? That's Britain, right? They're just the crime lord, right? And so they're trying to get the drugs everywhere. Um, and of course the Chinese declared war on drugs. Um, Not the war on drugs like Reagan and things like that, where it has other implications. It really was a war on opium, right? So of course they passed these numerous reforms and laws sort of opposing drug usage. Um, and sort of they had their own version of a DEA, right? Hunting down these British smugglers, making sure that, the drugs weren't coming into China. But then that's where the British sort of played their cards right. And they were like, whoa. And like the East India Company told the like House of Commons, and they were like, well, hold up now, they're imposing on our trade because they're stopping our trade from going into China. Like that's not cool. Why are they doing that? We got to do something about that. But even though, the East India Company didn't tell the House of Commons that opium was illegal in China, right? And so it's like the House of Commons sees this, so it's like, oh yeah, they are impeding on our trade. Let's declare war, right? And so this is how we get the opium wars. And of course, the British won. And this shows their sort of strength to, these Asian powers that like, hey, look, our rapid industrialization is making us this powerful nation now. And so now, of course, China gave British Hong Kong as sort of a colony to store their goods in. And it was a port colony as well. So that was useful, for traveling and getting goods across through these sea trade networks. Um, so now we're sort of seeing not only is there sort of an like a physical imperialism, there's also this cultural imperialism. Sort of I've already talked about this notion a little bit already, but sort of using culture to convert people, right? Sort of we see this, this is a major reason why the Sepoy Revolt happened, right? A lot of the people who are in sort of these like armies or militias had to like tear open, I forget what it was, but they had to tear something out open for like their guns, and it was lined with pork or cows, and whether there was Muslims or Hindus that challenged their beliefs. And so British here is now imposing that like you forget your beliefs and follow us, and we're going to impose this strict cultural imperialism on you. And of course, you get the Sepoy Revolt. You guys can look at the details for that, but just really want to focus on the idea of like imposing culture, right? I already said like through many elites and the colonies aligned with British to gain support. We talked about that a little bit today too, but we can see also like a lot of the elites, would send their children to British universities, things like that, spreading this wealth of knowledge, like British knowledge, and throughout and the culture throughout sort of this colony and things like that. And Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela, they were all went through this sort of British system. Um, Sort of, I make another comparison, like think of sort of like natives gaining status in the British Empire with the Spanish and the Tlaxcalans, right? So we see that, hey, you're helping us, you're an ally to us, we're going to give you power, right? And you have to follow our cultural trends, things like that. Um, Now switching more to sort of like how these European powers will impose culture in the future, right? And sort of the first one is sort of the formation of Germany, right? Where we get the beginning of Germany, and how, of course, later in World War II, we see this culture will be imposed later on. But how do we get that Germany to begin with? So we start there. So of course you get the Franco-Prussian War was used to unite Germany by Otto von Bismarck. I forgot to include his name there, but Otto von Bismarck really wanted to stop the spread of the socialist movement and things like that after he united Germany by inciting all these wars to get sort of these Prussian states to align with one another. So he adopted socialist parties to get everybody aboard, right? So he sponsors worksman conversation for workers pensions, um, free and mandatory public education, had a united Germany diet, right? And it's not the diet, when you're trying to get healthy, but of course the legislation. Um, so we're seeing sort of like Germany start to become sort of a unified nation too, so they can impose their culture later on. Of course, you get the Congress of Berlin where that carves up Africa, right? They're imposing European culture down there as well now, because it's basically no African nation was in this Congress of Berlin to determine whether they can be carved up or not. So it's all European sort of notions, right? They're now, and then why I had this last one, it sort of highlights that, the European powers are the ones that are culturally and economically dominant. They're making the decisions for everyone now, right? It seems like, with the Congress of Berlin, also with like the Opium Wars, like you have to listen to European powers because they have the power, right? And you can't really do much against it, except what if you're Japan? And why is Japan so different, right? Um, and I think we all know that that's because they adopted this industrialization. They're proving their worth and sort of their value as an industrial nation, right? So how did they get there? Of course, the reform is to overthrow the shogunate, and sort of Japan industrializes using Britain, Germany, and the U.S. for examples, right? So we see sort of Britain taking, going back to the Dutch, right? They see industrialization happening because of the Dutch trading, right? So they can do that. And of course, later on, the British will force Japan to sort of open their borders, so to say. So we'll see later, then they start getting more influences, but they still can control their own destiny in a sense, right? They choose what's imposed on them or not, though their borders are open. But what that does is just highlight how much they have grown to be an industrial power. Um, we start seeing the culture shift in Japan, right? It's now coming to this more capitalist notion, right? It's no longer the aristocrats who are the samurai in power. It's the commoners, the bourgeoisie, those who have sort of these businesses and corporations, things like that. And then also we see sort of a progressive, Emperor Meiji, right? He sort of wrote haiku, right? Ties to romanticism, going into this idea of art and beauty and things like that. Establishes an imperial diet, which is a constitutional not monarchy and has power over taxation, right? Um, and another thing is like he was involved in the Russo-Japanese War, but the main takeaway from that war is that Japan has power. They're in an industrialized nation, and they can compete with other nations, right? Especially beating Japan or beating Russia, who is sort of an already like not the best, but like it's European, right? And so it's this idea that an Asian power is now beating a European power that, sort of rose some alarms with the European powers. Like, okay, Japan's kind of in the game. They can play, right? They can be a part of our team. Um, and of course, later on, not really involved in World War One, but then they get huge and involved in World War Two. And we discussed that in class, so I won't be focusing too much on that, the details of that, right? So World War One, I'm gonna keep it short and sweet. So we all know it's the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, after these ethnic feuds, right? Um, the Serbians with the Austro-Hungarians, right, wanting to be Austro-Hungary, Serbia, this major triad of things, right? But now, of course, the Serbian nationalists didn't want that. They want to be their own nation, so they assassinated sort of this progressive archduke. And then it became a war of allies, right? That's sort of how we know and understand World War One. And I'm not going to go into details of like the allies and things like that. But what to take away is sort of going back to this idea, like enlightenment thinking, romantic thinking ideology of like what's going on with the parties? Like, how are parties viewing sort of societies and things like that? And we're seeing all the parties are aligning with the war, right? There's no party that is not going different, like against it. So like they're all using their notions to then align, like sort of reason with this war and why this war is important. Though the major sort of separation we see in that is sort of the socialists in Russia, the Bolsheviks, right? They don't want the war at all because they see the economic implications it has and it's devastating them as a country. So it's like it's better to back out than it is to keep going in. And also during this war, we get many military advancements, right? I know we talked about the planes, how reconnaissance was used, also like the guns, the improvement of guns. But then we also start to see the collapse and fall of the Middle East after the fall of the Ottomans, though Mustafa Kemal, sort of the leader of the Ottomans, had some great victories against the British, right? Because we're able to upset them and surprise them with military tactics. But of course, the British managed to overthrow them and sort of play ethnicities against each other in the Middle East and then come in and sort of be like, oh, you guys are questioning a lot of things. There's a power vacuum. We're just gonna swoop right in and take control, right? Um, so we see now again, like sort of this British power or European power taking over these other parts of the world, right? Without their say and things like that. And we start to see that imperialism happen again, in World War One. Um, and sort of now let's sort of focus on sort of the societal aspect of World War One. What's happening with women and things like that. I mentioned Lloyd George a little bit earlier, but he's sort of the reformist progressive, prime minister during this time, and he's pushing this legislation for women to get the vote, the Social Security and the workman's comp, like Otto von Bismarck for the Social Security aspect, and he's following sort of this legislation for women vote from this sort of enlightenment thinking, but also from these sort of revolutionaries and this sort of sense of fighting for equal rights, right? So we get Emmeline Pankhurst, right, sort of spearheaded this movement, grew up reform-minded, was lower class, and saw the struggles of like the everyday woman, right? And sort of wanted to fight so women could have a political stance. And then she had a daughter who wanted to intertwine with the socialist movement, but she didn't want to do that because it would take away from the value of fighting for the right for a vote. And there was no need to join the movement because a lot of people already was displeased or discomforted. I had discomfort with sort of this socialist ideology, right? Again, it was attached to communism and all these different things, and you're seeing it throughout the world, and sort of communism and socialism becoming the bad guy, though we get Kingism, who sort of implements these socialist ideologies later on, and so it gets more accepted, sort of like you get your social democrats, right? So really not socialist, things like that. That's going into more modern politics, but I was seeing that like this is the beginning of something that they didn't like this movement. They knew they had power and they knew they could start and get something, and they didn't want to attach it to something that was already being questioned, already being fought, right? So of course, women get the right to vote at age 30, and men's was then decreased to 20. But then of course the women's vote was then decreased to the age of 20 later on. But then also what we see in sort of the societal life is sort of fashion for women is being revolutionized, especially Coco Chanel, right? Introducing this ideology of the black dress, which makes it easier and less time consuming for women, makes them, it's going away from this nuclear lifestyle, right? You're now going into this new ideology and this newfound territory that hasn't been explored for women, right? And that's tying along with this notion that they're now able to be political activists. They're now able to have the right to vote, right? So they're getting a lot of new ideologies coming in for, women and sort of the world, the rest of society in Europe, right? This progressive notion. Um, so now, tying everything back to, let's focus on the Russian Revolution real quick. So of course, the Tsar entered World War One. That war devastated Russia. Germany thought they could be Russia, so they let Lenin in to cause problems, socially and throughout the nation. So of course, there's the early revolution, the socialist, takes the majority of the Duma. Then with, you know, the Russians being in the war, and they're realizing that US is going to join and the war is going to be over soon, right? They didn't want sort of to raise any alarms with their sort of socialist movement, so they sort of backed out of the war. And that's when Lenin goes around and to gain sort of this power and authority throughout the world, because he already started to win some people over, but he still needed to win more people over. He started promoting this ideology, and this he had this one line of peace, land, and bread, right? And that won over the workers, the urban workers in Petrograd and Moscow, as they really needed the peasants to win. Sort of this war, and the war is sort of the revolution, right? The socialist revolution. So Lenin takes power and he begins implementing programs and treaties to create peace and economic stability, right? So what he's promoting and his one-liners, right? Peace, land, and bread. He's doing this, right? And so it's giving merit to sort of this socialist revolution. It's not just baseless things that people are saying to win sort of political clout. Now it's okay, this could be actually something, right? This could actually mean something. Sort of going, as I mentioned earlier, sort of this is what Lenin takes. He takes this more like progressive route with Marxist thinking, and sort of jumps his theory and fast tracks it to this sort of communist, sort of socialist ideology. Of course, now let's focus on sort of the outcomes of World War One, right? We see the outcome that happens with the Russians. What about the rest of the world, right? Every country is broke. Their pockets are dry, except for the US, of course, right? Because they really weren't involved too much with the war. Um, we start seeing sort of, as I mentioned earlier, Keynes implementing he promotes sort of his economic plans and his economic ideology, sort of following liberal enlightened ideology. So it didn't get fully adopted after World War One, but we're seeing more in World War Two. But it did get adopted in the Dawn's plan, right? So this was sort of give sort of money, a loan to Germany, help them rebuild their economy, allow them to produce coal and iron, so that they can pay off the money, right? Because if they have no means of production, how are they going to provide money? If they're broke, how are they going to provide money? You got to jumpstart them a little bit. And that's going to this idea of like government regulation, right? Giving, and it ties to like sort of socialist ideology, right? It allows the government to sort of regulate economy in a sense. And sort of that is what's sort of liberal sort of economics is now. Sort of you allow this sort of government to still allow competition and equal trade and fair and equal trade and all that. But now it's sort of the government has a little hand here and there just in case it gets too far, or like a monopoly, things like that. But what happens when the creditor nation goes under, right? Sort of US is the only creditor nation, right? And that's where we get the Great Depression. That's where we start seeing all these economies throughout the world drop and fall because they all depend on the US. Um, and this is sort of what leads to World War II, right? Because of course, during this time, the countries are down during the Great Depression, things like that. People are not believing in the system that is already in place because it is failing. So what you then see is sort of these new ideologies that I mentioned earlier, right? These fascist and socialist ideologies run rampant in a lot of these European countries, Germany, Italy, Spain, you could argue as well, although that one's a little tricky. Right? So like many of these ideologies are sort of on the fact of restoring glory, tying this back to sort of that social Darwinism, right? Survival of the fittest. You're in a trying time in the Great Depression where every country is suffering. So you need to be the ones who can come out on top and have the power and have this authority and be stable, right? And so, um, Mussolini, Hitler, these charismatic leaders are promoting that with their new visions, right? Their socialist ideologies, their fascist ideologies, controlling the state, ensuring that the economies can recover and that the glory that was lost from World War One can be get recovered as well. And then that's where we see sort of the Nazi Party begins to take power in the Reichstag. But then, as time progressed, they started to lose, right? As the economy starts getting stable, everybody's fine and dandy, right? The people who actually supported the Nazi Party were sort of the white collar workers, the intellectuals, right? Instead of what you need, the workers, right? Like going back to Marx believed it's the workers who could, you know, or going back to Lenin, excuse me, it's the workers you needed to win at war, right? It's because that's the ideology. You have the lower class support you the most. Those are the people you need, not the intellectuals. So of course, Hitler saw that and sort of seized power immediately of the Reichstag, and that's where they control. And then the Nationalist Socialist Party takes reins, and that's where we see sort of the Nazi Party we were familiar with take over and implement all their things. Um, and if you want to see a great propaganda film on um, sort of Nazi Germany, we've already discussed it in class, but The Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl. I just had to recently watch that for a political class, and it was very fascinating. You don't see sort of everything you hear about in the books, right? You sort of see the perspective of Germans at the time and how they viewed this society, and it really was that Hitler came in and saved them essentially, and they restored glory to it. So, right, this new sort of like the social Darwinistic approach to fascism is coming into play here, right? The survival of the fittest. They became the ones who survived essentially, and that's sort of the notions I saw from that sort of documentary, or propaganda film. So now let's focus on sort of the outcomes of World War II, right? What happens after the war? The global organizations. First, you get the economic sort of implications. You get Bretton Woods creating the International Money Fund to stabilize exchange rates, right? It takes control to stabilize the rates to ensure the rates are up to standard. You get the World Bank to reduce poverty, right? Again, these are these Keynesianism ideologies being in play worldwide. It's not just FDR's, new plan. It's not these social sort of social democrat economic, implications throughout, America. It's around the world, right? They're now using these ideologies from Keynesianism and from this alignment thinking to promote sort of stability in this government regulation. Um, and then socially, of course, we get oppositions to sort of this um, new economic thinking, right? Because of course, Gandhi's challenging, this Keynesianism economics because Keynesianism doesn't consider sort of the limitlessness of environmental issues. Like there are things that are going to be running out. There's not enough resources for us in the world to keep going down this route. And we're sort of seeing a lot of it now, climate change, things like that are happening because people are stressing so hard about gaining wealth and power in this industry. But Gandhi raises this question, right? Going back to sort of that romantic thinking, right? We see Keynesianism as alignment thinking. Gandhi is now romantic thinking, right? He's questioning, well, what are the outcomes of this? What's going to happen because of this? What's going to happen to the world? What's going to happen to us because of this, right? And again, we have the answer to that: climate change, things like that. So you can see it's these thoughts are, very early on, and they're being proposed by, people who can see and understand the value through these sort of romantic enlightenment thinkings. So that's it. Um, Hopefully that wasn't too long, and I apologize for the late delay. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Um, I'll probably put my email in the announcement I send. So if you do need to contact me before, I will be available all day Wednesday. So any questions, anything to, clarify things like that, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.